Okay, so just a reminder of the sketch corpus itself. So there's some key parameters to the sketch corpus. It needs to have minimally two children, and these ages of the children will be between 2 and 4. If it has only two children, then these children will be followed from ages 2 to 4 years. But as we're going to go through a moment in the next moments, we'll talk about the different ways in which the sketch corpus can be constructed, so that you can have more than two children. So the gender of the children hopefully will be a mix of genders if that's possible. And the type of data will be preferably naturalistic interaction with other children and adults, although it could be written from a semi-naturalistic data. The recording schedule, as we'll go through, is ideally longitudinal, but in most cases that might not be possible. So in the next ideal case could be cross-lagged, and then the final case could be cross-sectional. The amount of data to be recorded is minimally 10 hours, but the amount to be processed would be minimally 5 hours. So go down. So what are the motivations for this setup? So we want the children to be recorded between 2 and 4 years, because this is when a lot of the nuts and bolts of language acquisition is happening. So at the age of 2, some children will have a small vocabulary of first words used in utterances of 2 or more morphemes, but they won't have very sophisticated language skills typically. But by the age of 4, they'll have a lot of the major nuts and bolts of language that will be in place. They'll have a much larger vocabulary than they will have had when they're 2. They'll be producing multi-word utterances, and they'll be fairly productive in major parts of morphology. So they've made a lot of generalizations that enable productivity. The motivations for selecting a mix of genders is driven by a potential or a course attempt to account for individual differences. And this is also the case with using a longitudinal setup. When one uses a longitudinal setup, what you're doing is controlling for the child's prior knowledge or differences in children's prior knowledge by comparing that child to themselves. And this is why a longitudinal setup is ideal, although not strictly required, given the sort of overarching goal of the sketch corpus being that any data should be good data to write a sketch. The final motivation is that we should be trying to get naturalistic-like interactions, because this enables us to not just look at the data, but look at a whole bunch of other things, like it can give insights into socialization practices and then access to the ambient language itself. So an analysis of the input. So in the sketch manual itself, we have the ideal longitudinal setup. So in the ideal longitudinal setup, you would have 2 children and you would follow them from ages 2 years until the age of 4 years. And you could collect, for instance, every 6 months, 1 hour of data from each child and process 30 minutes of that data. And that would add up to your 5 hours that you would need for a sketch. But of course, many of us won't have the time or the resources to be able to follow 2 children for 2 years. And so the opposite end of the spectrum is to run a cross-sectional study. So if you're going to the field, or if you were in a place and your time was limited and you were able to collect data, minimal amounts of data from, say, 10 children, then you could have a fully cross-sectional study where you collected data from children ages 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 4, and 30 minutes from 2 children at each of those ages. And that would add up to your 5 hours of processed data and 10 hours of data overall. And of course, an intermediate solution is to adopt a cross-lagged approach. And you'll see quite a few examples of the cross-lagged approach in the case studies that we're going to present to you today. And the realities of creating a sketch corpus are that there'll be many different reasons for why your corpus may look different from the ideal setup, and it might be it might have some kind of intermediate solution between, say, the longitudinal setup and the cross-sectional setup. Some of those can be that you have existing data. It could be the availability of the children or the number of children that are learning the language itself if the language is endangered. You could have intermittent access to a field site or to a city, which would mean that may dictate the parameters of your sketch corpus itself. And of course, the length of data collection phase of the project may restrict or may end up structuring the nature of your corpus due to pragmatic reasons. So what we suggest, of course, is that the golden guiding principle of writing a sketch is that any data is better than no data. And therefore, that's why we want to have a very flexible idea or flexible approach to creating a sketch corpus. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca, who's going to tell you about her sketch corpus or Pitjantjatjara.
Hi. Thanks, Evan, for that intro. So yes, I'll be talking about Pitjantjatjara, and it's great to have Wanima Whiten here with us today. So Wanima did honours with me, an honours thesis, and worked with this sketch corpus, and made a lot of the decisions and did a lot of thinking about how this corpus should be constructed. So we can also kind of bring him into the discussion if we need to. So can you just go to the next slide, Evan?
Yep. There you go.
I guess I should have said Pitjantjatjara is a language spoken in Central Australia around Uluru. Okay. So as you can see here, this is not the ideal situation. There's 5 children, not 2. And it's kind of much kind of patchier across these times. And the reasons for this were, we were working from, while we had more data, a lot of it was not transcribed yet. And we were making this corpus at the start of the COVID lockdowns, and getting to the community to complete transcriptions wasn't possible and wouldn't be possible for some time. And so we were working with the data that we already had transcribed. And we didn't have any one child that had data across all the 5 time points. There were 3 children that we could have taken 4 of the time points from, but then this left this kind of unbalanced hole where there was one child filling in the little spots here and there. And there were also difficulties with each of those 3 children. So one of them had a suspected language delay, and the other 2 were recorded at kind of intermediate points, in that they tended to be recorded at 2 and 9 months and 3 and 3 months, rather than the 2, 2, 6, 3, 3, 6, etc. So fitting them, unless we kind of completely shifted over to that schedule, it would have been difficult. And so what we did was construct this corpus with the 5 children, where we aim to have each time point, so from 2 to 2.6, there's one child for which we have data from each of those time points. So we have data from Andrew at 2 and at 2.6. And for the jump from 2.6 to 3, we've got data again from Andrew. From 3 to 3.6, we've got data from Rachel, and so on. So for each time point, we've got one child which we can compare within that child across that time point. And we aimed to have 2 time points for each child. The only exception for this was we had to fill in Anne for one of the time points, and there just wasn't a neat match. We didn't have data for Anne, which could have then replaced one of the other points and met that having one child overlapping each of the time points criteria. the other thing I wanted to mention here is that Izzy at 3-6 gave us the bonus data in that Izzy is actually talking to Andrew at 2 and 9 months. So that's a little grade section of 2 and 9 months. So we've got a bit of extra in between data for Andrew there. And we had a mix of genders, so 2 girls and 3 boys. That was all I wanted to talk about. Any questions? Let me know.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. I'll now go down and then we can hear from Birgit, who would tell us about Karket.
Thanks, Evan. I'm going to introduce the Karket sketch corpus. The Karket is a language that's spoken in Papua New Guinea. And Evan, can you just move forward? So again, what you see here, we don't have an ideal scenario. And it's again for similar reasons as Rebecca just outlined. The data has also been extracted from a larger longitudinal corpus, but it was limited by what was already transcribed. And this then in turn necessitated a cross-legged approach instead of the ideal longitudinal approach. But we made some different decisions on the way than Rebecca outlined for Pitjantjatjara. So the first consideration was, of course, to match the ages as closely as possible. And you can see that largely worked except for the age 30, where we didn't have data available for any child at exactly age 30. But as you also see in the sketch corpus format, we allow for differences of 1 plus minus 2 months to cater exactly for this difficulty in fieldwork settings. Another consideration was that we wanted to have at least 2 consecutive ages for each child. And what you see here is this decision resulted in a younger age group, where we have 2 children recorded at 20 and 26, and an older age group, 2 children recorded at 3, 6, and 4. And different from the Pitjantjatjara case, we just saw we do have a gap between 2, 6, and 3. So we don't have data from the same child across this gap, and we can't compare the development within the same child between the ages of 2, 6, and 3. And we also attempted a mix of genders, which looks as if it beautifully worked out, but it was a total coincidence. Can you move on, Evan? Then we had a further consideration. We wanted to capture naturalistic interaction. And this, what you see here is the participant structure of the recording. So we essentially wanted recordings where at least one other child and at least one other adult were present. And what you see here is that we were able to select recordings and sessions where this was the case, but you can probably also see that there are sometimes quite large numbers of participants, like 5 additional participants, and you can imagine what that meant for the transcription process. It's beautifully natural data, but transcription was severely delayed by that. And then the final slide. Again, with respect to the naturalistic interaction, there are 3 typical settings in the Karket community where children participate in. That's in the village where they play or stay in and around the house. It's in the family garden, which is usually some kilometers away from the village, in the bush, where they stay with their family, doing subsistence gardening. And a third setting, children alone in the bush, so groups of younger and older children without any adults roaming around in the bush. And one consideration that we had was we tried to capture a variety of settings. We couldn't manage to do any recordings in the bush. It was technically just too challenging, but we do have village and garden scenarios. And I just wanted to use this slide to highlight an important trade-off or balance between 2 considerations. So one consideration is to keep everything as comparable as possible. So basically just record in one setting or just record boys or just record girls or just record sessions with the same participant structure. The advantage of this is that the sessions are more easily comparable. The language that is used in these sessions is more easily comparable. The disadvantage is it captures only a very small part of the child's environment. And so it is what we've tried instead is to capture the diversity, but it does come at the expense of comparability. And given that both factors have distinct advantages and disadvantages, we decided on purpose not to make any recommendations. I think we've been going back and forth on this issue when devising the manual. And in the end, we decided we just can't give a recommendation, and we would just ask people, whatever setup they choose, to take it into account later for the analysis of the sketch data. And I think that's it from me.
Great. Thanks, Birgit. And now we can move on to Murimpata with Lucy.
Hello. So Murimpata is an Australian language spoken in the north of the country, so southwest of Darwin. Next slide, please, Evan. Thank you. So if you glance at this very, very quickly, it looks like the ideal situation, but it isn't. So we decided to go with 2 children. They both happen to be girls, but we started at the age of 2.5, so 2 years and 6 months, and went to 4 years and 6 months. So that is not an ideal situation. We decided to do this because there was no earlier recording of Emily. These are pseudonyms, by the way. There was of Acacia, but it was essentially her and another kid sitting there sucking on an orange for about 50 minutes. So we decided we weren't going to get much useful data from that recording. There was a boy who we have recordings at these ages for, but it turned out he had a speech delay that was clear about halfway through recording him. So yeah, we've got from 2.5 to 4.5. And roughly, not exactly. And I will point out something that I'm not happy with, but we're pursuing it anyway, going through with it anyway. So if you look at the final columns for Emily, so we've got a recording of her at 4 years and 1 month, but then for her 4.5 time point, she's actually 4 years and 3 months. So that's not great. It's outside of the 2 months buffer. But we decided that to have it's valuable enough to have 2 children longitudinally that it doesn't really matter. It's better to do this rather than, like, we could have cobbled together a corpus of from 2.5 to 4.5 of all different kids, or a cross-lagged approach. But since we were so close to being able to do it with just 2 children, we thought it was worthwhile to do that. I should also add that this was naturalistic recordings of children, so a few children and adults on picnics and regular sort of situations for them like that. And I think that was all I wanted to say. Oh, and one other thing, another non-ideal aspect. You can see in the 2 later recordings for Acacia, they're not that long, the recordings. So one was 44 minutes, one was 33 minutes. It poured with rain at the 33-minute one, so we had to pack up and run off. But again, we've still got the data and it's worth doing. And that's all I have to say, I think.
Great, thanks, Lucy. So finally, now we'll go over to Shanley, who will tell us about Inuktitut.
Great. Thank you very much. So Inuktitut is spoken in northern Canada. There's about 34,000 speakers. And you see here a very different situation from all the beautiful beaches and outdoor woods settings. This is above the tree line and cold most of the year, although that's changing, unfortunately. But anyway, okay, so next slide, thanks. All right, so the Inuktitut data, like actually several of the previous corpora, came from data that was already collected. All of this data were recorded over the period 1986 to 1990 for 2 separate dissertations. And so there were recordings for 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, once every 4 months for a year, the first 4 in the chart here. And then for 4 other children, again, 2 boys and 2 girls, every month for 9 months. So over the period of 9 months. And that was the data that we had available. So you'll see across the top the age 1, 2, 3, and then the months in the next line. And the red boxes indicate that we have about 4 hours of data recorded at that time point, and about 2 hours of that were transcribed. So that's the full set of data. We haven't talked much about recording, but these data were collected a long time ago when there weren't a lot of fancy recording tools. So they were simply collected by a video camera with no external microphone, and that worked okay. But that did mean that data were recorded in homes and not outdoors, because it was too hard following kids around and also just too windy outdoors. And the videotaping, which might be problematic in some cultures, was not a problem for Inuit because they're very used to learning by observation. So that was a normal strategy for them, and several of them had their own video cameras anyway. Okay, next slide. So from that total amount of data, then, we wanted to create the data for the sketch corpus. And maybe the first thing you'll notice is that we have no data older than 3-6. So opposite to Lucy's situation that she just mentioned, where they didn't have younger data, we had plenty of younger data, but no older data. And we also had only one child older than 3-4. So that meant if we wanted to have 2 children at the same time period, then about 3-4 was the oldest that we could go. And so we decided to shift things younger. And another problem with our data set was that for the younger ages, we only had every 4 months for kids. So we couldn't simply say, okay, we'll take something in the middle, because we didn't have any data for that. So in the end, after lots of consideration, we decided to go for 1-4, 1-10, 2-4, 2-10, and 3-4, because that fit the data that we had, and allowed us to have 2 children more or less at each age point. Well, have 2 children exactly at each age point, but with this 2 months either way taken into account. And although the time points aren't like 1, 6, 2, they're at least 6 months apart. So this shows some of the flexibility in fitting the sketch format to the data you have available, or the children you have available, or whatever. Yeah, and then we selected the times when we had 2 children available. So if you go to the next slide, we can see this a bit more easily. So this slide is in the same format as the other ones you've seen. And so you see that we actually have data from 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 children out of the 8. And a couple of children, like Lizzie and Sarah, are at 2 time points, and all the other children are just at 1 time point. So you may say, why did you do this? Because all the children were recorded longitudinally, and so wouldn't that have been easy to do? But they weren't recorded in this 6 months apart session. And also, for the 4 older children, the youngest child was quite precocious, and the oldest child was relatively not clinically delayed, but a bit slower than her peers. And so even though the data were actually recorded longitudinally, it didn't really fit very well to have most of them longitudinally in the corpus. So this is kind of the other extreme from what Lucy showed. It's much more completely cross-sectional. And also we see, I think, the most here of all the sketches so far, the up to 2 months deviation from the target age. So for 1-4, we succeeded in having 2 kids right at 1-4, but for 1-10, we had 1 child 1 month older and 1 2 months older. For 2-4, they were both 2 months older, etc. And so, of course, that needs to be taken into account. Another important consideration for us was selecting sessions that include caregiver speech, because a big part of the acquisition sketch is also looking at the caregiver speech. And because of the nature of the way that Inuit interact with their children and each other, much of our data was children interacting with their peers. often siblings or cousins, but also friends with no adults around. And the caregiver data we focused on was all from adults because the peers were mostly same age or maybe a year older, not like, 10-year-old child looking after the little sister or something. And so a lot of our recordings didn't have any caregiver speech in them, or not very much. And so that again restricted which recordings we could consider for the sketch. If we had several options of ones to use, then we prioritized sessions with lots of utterances to give us the most data available. And as I said, all of our recordings were indoors because outdoors was either too windy or, of course, in the winter too cold, or the children ran around so much that it was difficult to get very much language out of them. Okay, I think those are the main points for the Inuktitut corpus. Thank you.
Okay, so just before we open it up to questions, we have a website for the project, and this is the URL for that. There, it's got information about sketch corpora, and it's got examples and archiving options. So here's just a screenshot of what you can see at the website itself. So please go there, and if you're in the middle or about to write your sketch. So I'll stop sharing now, and I will open it up to questions. So please, if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand, or you can type it into the chat, and then we can do our very best to answer your question. If it's about the construction of the corpus, that would be great. If you have other questions, that's also okay.
Ask a question. Actually, two questions. One is that how are you planning to publish this work? I mean, once the projects are done and the analysis is done. And the other one is that, is there any possibility of any funding that will help us, have a research assistant, pay a research assistant for this?
I can take that one. So the publication of the sketch is a model, right, on how to write a sketch for acquisition of a language. So at the moment we have a special publication at Language Documentation and Conservation, and that's a living issue at the moment. So if people write a sketch, they can submit it to us, and then we can after reviews and revisions and all that kind of stuff, it can be published in a special publication. That's one avenue of publication. Another one, hopefully, will be that other language acquisition journals, for instance, may take up the model of the sketch and publish them, although that's something for the journals themselves to consider. So at the moment, in the first instance, it's a special publication of Language Documentation and Conservation. Your second question about funding. So we don't have funding in the sense that we don't have a steady stream of income that we can give out to people who can do this stuff, unfortunately, because we have to get funding for our own projects. So what we see the whole sketch acquisition project is, and the manual is a model for how people can begin to work on acquisition of a language that might be understudied. But unfortunately, it's really up to the individual to try and get funding for their particular project itself.
Thank you.
Ask a question?
Yes.
I was wondering whether you had a chance, or maybe somebody had a chance to use this model on already existing data on childless, for instance, to see if you get the same kind of developmental sketch that you would get from the language sketch model, just to make sure that it's valid and that you get the same kind of information, developmental information or acquisitional information using this model.
Yeah, sure. I think that question I can give to both Shanley and Birgit, who can tell you more about both Inuktitut and German. So Birgit, why don't you take that first, and then Shanley will be able to talk about more about Inuktitut.
Okay, thanks, Evan. Thanks for the question. We've done this actually as an MA project for the acquisition of German, where an MA student for her MA thesis did the sketch model on the child's corpus on German and looked specifically at the acquisition of case marking in German. She selected case marking because we know a lot about the acquisition of case marking, and she essentially checked whether the sketch data that she constructed from the sketch corpus she constructed out of Childers gave the same results. And the encouraging bit is, yes, it gave the same result. It didn't capture all the phenomena, especially low frequency phenomena didn't show up, but salient phenomena did show up, and there was nothing that's so essentially the sketch data won't give you the answer to all the questions about the development of children, but it won't give you wrong answers. She has written up her results in the special issue that Evan just mentioned of language documentation and conservation. It's Jana Urbanchik acquisition of case marking. And I think, maybe Shanley, you can say something more about Inuktitut.
So I looked at this a little bit in Inuktitut. I haven't done it super thoroughly, but my impressions are the same as what Birgit said. For frequent phenomena and salient phenomena, I've found the same pattern. So actually in the last acquisition sketch project workshop, I showed a couple of slides of one of looking at mean length of utterance based on the sketch data, and found that there was a very clear increase in mean length of utterance that fits very well with a larger study that I've done with much more data from Inuktitut, showing a similar kind of increase. And I also looked at the mean length of word in morphemes and showed a very clear increase in how long the words are over time, and when, for example, 6 morpheme words start coming in, and the pattern from the sketch data matched with pattern from a larger set of data that I found. And the other slide I showed, I think, was about passives. So I've done a bigger study of passive, showing that full passives come in fairly early in Inuktitut, and shorter passives also come in quite early, and that was visible in the sketch data too. So in the sketch data, there were only 11 passives, which is not very many, but there were passives, and not only in the older children, also in the younger children, and there was 1 full passive. So you certainly couldn't say absolutely definitively, here we know everything about passives from the sketch data, but you could definitely say, the prediction is we shouldn't see any passives until 4, but look, here we see several in this data, 2, 2.5, and even a full passive. It would definitely be worth looking at this further, and this is, something that could be good for a larger project. So that's
So would you accept such comparative papers, like looking at already existing databases, but sampling them according to the language sketch and then comparing to new data?
Yes, definitely we would. So the paper that Birgit mentioned from German is one we already have in the special issue, and we definitely welcome more things, because I think you're absolutely right. There's absolutely no point in doing this whole acquisition sketch project
if you don't get the same kind of result.
Out of that. Right, and so showing that is going to be crucial to the project. So definitely that's a great idea.
And if I can just put a cherry on top of that, one thing that we were really cognizant about when we were writing the sketch was the idea that we don't really go well beyond the data. So Shanley's examples of the passives is a good one about this. So what she found is that they occur early in Inuktitut, which is very consistent with work she's done with a greater amount of data. But if the situation was reversed and you only had 5 hours of data, you didn't have a big data set to compare it against, you wouldn't be making grand theoretical arguments on the basis of a couple of uses of the passives. But like Shanley says, what you'd be doing is you'd be flagging it as saying, well, look, this is coming in, given what we know about sampling, this may show us that they're early acquired in the language, but you would be very careful not to make really grand generalizations on the basis of the appearance of of a few examples of what might be low frequency phenomena. So we have a question here in the chat from Celestino, which says, what is the time frame for the project? That is, what specific activities are involved and when should they be accomplished? So I guess really we don't have a time frame in general. So the way that we've done, we're working for quite a few years on writing the manual itself. And then we've begun this special publication in language documentation and conservation. And this is one possible publication outlet. That will stay live for quite a while. I don't know, Birgit, if we have like a time frame on when it closes. We don't. Birgit shaking her head. But hopefully, it's our hope that this model has a life beyond the special publication, so that, like I said before, like hopefully what would happen is that other publication outlets that are a bit more enduring, say journals, use it as a publication format. So the answer to the question is when should these activities be accomplished? It's when you are able to accomplish them, I suppose, is the only real answer I can give to that. And I hope that answers your question in general. But I see Rowena has raised her hand. And so, Rowena, can you ask your question?
Thank you so much again for the presentations. I have two related questions. So one, I work with a language with a bigger population. So I do have the chance to collect more data, so to say, or a better one. So it makes me think how picky I should be. It makes me think how much effort should I put in the very beginning of really choosing, because there will be more work eventually. So that's one, how picky I should be. And two, will I no longer have to be worried about being picky if I just include more children, let's say double the number, or is that not in the spirit of Sketch to include just more?
Shanley, do you want to have a go at this? And then
yeah, this is a great question for research in general. Let me start with the second question. I've been wondering about that as well, because I have a student who is starting out doing a sketch of Mongolian, and he's starting from scratch and has access to lots of children. And I think, I don't know, we haven't talked about this in the group at all. I guess my reaction would be start with 2, but tape more kids such that you can then expand it beyond that, because collecting the data is really easy. Transcribing it is the next easy thing, but then annotating it and analyzing it is also going to take a long time. So if you're really starting from scratch with just 2 children in 5 hours, and you're working on it, pretty regularly, I guess it's going to take you a year if you're fairly focused. And so it took us 6 months of half to 3/4 time work with data that was already transcribed and annotated, but somebody that hadn't really worked much with Inuktitut before to finish the sketch. And so the more children, each child you add is going to take that much more time. And so I personally see no problem with adding another couple of children to increase generalizability. But on the other hand, a finished project is better than a perfect project that it has never done. So I guess I want to take that into account. Then you asked about being picky. Yeah, and I think my answer is sort of similar here. I mean, the more picky you can be, the better, I guess, because if you have the luxury to really get exactly 2, 2.5, or exactly 2 children of different genders that are balanced, blah, blah, in the perfect situations, that's great. But if you spend so much time and work on that you don't finish the project, that's not great. And better to have some data than no data. Actually, I think you can never have perfect data. So it's not clear to me that if you have 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, recorded exactly on the birthday and exactly, 6 months and 2 hours from whatever, that's going to be any better than if it's, a couple of weeks off or a month off. So I'm not sure it makes that much difference past a certain point. looks like Evan was agreeing because he was not.
That's excellent advice. So probably for not just Sketch, but for research in general. Thanks, Shanley. Asifa has a question in the chat. Is there any specific structure for the analysis of the data? We can come to that in future seminars or workshops. But in the first instance, I'd just direct you to the Sketch manual themselves, which goes through in quite a lot of detail the analysis of the data and the topics to include in a sketch. But next is Jessica, who has her hand up.
Thank you. So I have a question regarding the ethics approval. So I guess that every researcher to take care of the ethics approval themselves. But is there anything that you want us, because this is a project that includes like different researchers, is there anything that you want us to like ask for when it comes to the ethics approval and also the consent forms that we give the parents? So is there something that we should definitely put in there? Because I guess that's important for the data collection part.
It's a really good question. I'll give it a go, and then other people can jump in from their own experiences. So even though we're calling this a project, I think what this is hopefully is more of a movement than a project, in the sense that for us, if people just do a sketch and there's no people don't take the data from other sketches and compare across, then that would still be okay for us, because those sketches important for the field to diversify the number of languages we have, but also it's important for the speakers of those languages too. So coming back to your question of what would be good, I think that what is important, and this is going to depend on the country in which you're collecting the data, the country of your institution, all those kinds of things. So it's hard to give really definitive advice, is that the data can be used again, right? So you can transcribe it, you can put it in some form in an archive. So that could be Childers, it could be the archive in Cologne. And then the level at which you can deposit that and make it accessible is going to depend on a lot of different conversations. So for instance, of course, it's sometimes very difficult to have videos of children that are freely available, and that's okay. What would be best is if the transcripts minimally were available, I think, for reuse for people. And that's, I guess, the thing that jumps out at me, and I don't know if anyone else has any other stuff to add.
I just say for our group that I think it might be really nice if we put like an example consent form, an example information form at some point on the website. So if anybody is starting a project, I did my data collection, 30 years ago when the standards were very different. So I don't have any great examples, but if anybody's in the midst of designing things, we would be very happy to use your examples on the website. And please don't.
Well, I didn't collect data for the sketch project yet, but what I did is collecting data with Maltese children, and we got the ethics approval for that, and I put something in my form and it was accepted, so I could give you that. So we have this at least, but I'm not sure if it's then valid for all the other countries. So this is something that we need to have a look at. But I have a consent form that I gave the parents, and this was approved.
I think, as Evan said, it's probably different for different countries and different funding bodies. So probably what would be really good is to have several examples on our website so that people can look at those and take pieces from each, depending what's useful for them. So that would be very helpful if you would send us stuff, and anybody else who's working on this.
Yeah, it's an excellent question and a really important issue, I think. So Alexandra Vella has asked the question. I'm guessing that for most of these languages, there would be exposure to the majority. There would be exposure to the majority languages given. Did the data from the languages you talked about include much mixing? I'll let all of you answer that. Some of these languages, I guess, were fairly acquired in fairly monolingual situations, but there are other instances where there are majority language influence. So I'll open that up to the others. Birgit, you can go.
Maybe I can say a little bit on that. For our project, we actually had recorded data in two different field sites, one that was fairly monolingual and one that was fairly multilingual. And when it came to the sketch corpus, we decided to go with the fairly monolingual field site, just to get started with what seemed easier at that time. So the sketch data actually does have very few mixing in it, but we could have gone with the other field side. And the reason I didn't do it was simply because I didn't know. I didn't want to start with the most difficult bit first. But I think maybe Shanley can say a bit more about this.
I think I would have the same reaction. So I've also done studies with monolingual and bilingual children. And I think if you don't know anything about the language, it's probably easier to start with monolingual children and then in a second project look at bilingual children and see if there's differences or similarities or whatever. But if you're in a field site where everyone is bilingual or where mixing is a standard part of the interaction, then that's a standard part of the interaction. And so don't hesitate to cover that.
Yeah, and it is the case that there will be instances of, especially with minority languages or endangered languages, they sort of get a lot of influence from majority languages, which means that they could be in a state of language change, for instance, because of this influence. And those situations will probably be fairly particular to that context. We don't have a really good way of a very hard and fast answer of how to deal with that. But I guess please contact us if you want to discuss more offline about your individual case. I think Rebecca wanted to say something as well.
Oh, yeah. Just that because working with Pitandara, a lot of people in the community were indeed concerned about mixing with English. And all the people there are to some extent bilingual. English is a part of daily life to some extent, and community members were very concerned about potential language shift and mixing with English. And I actually just recently looked, because I'm in the process of still analyzing the data and writing the sketch, and so I just looked at the use of different languages in the sketch corpus, and found that actually there was only about 7% of utterances from the children which use any English forms at all. And so the majority of utterances were solely in Pitandara, and that was just, so it was interesting to note, but it was also interesting to use the sketch as a very coarse initial kind of sample for the community. Say, look, actually, the kids are still using a lot of Pitandara, and to provide some data to discuss this concern about language mixing. Yeah. It wasn't a study of language mixing as such, but it's helpful information.
Right. Is there any more questions?
I had one other question, which was asked last time, which I thought was particularly relevant. It's one of the kind of reasons I thought we should do this session today, which hasn't come up yet. So I just thought I'd flag it in case anyone's thinking it but hasn't asked it, which was, I remember several people were concerned about the naturalistic element for the recording sessions, which we haven't really discussed that much today, but people considering whether they could use existing data which had been collected in more lab-like or kind of small group play sessions rather than just naturalistic conversation. And so I thought it might be nice to discuss that question. I don't know if any of us are particularly keen to address it.
I mean, my reaction would be what Evan put on one of the first slides: any data is better than no data. So if you have data collected that happens to be in a lab situation or play sessions or narrative or whatever, go ahead. It's better to start from somewhere than from nowhere. That's my personal reaction. Of course, you want to take that into account in the analysis, but data is data. Do others agree?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I can't see that there would be such variation if you were having a semi-naturalistic play session or something like that from being fully naturalistic. Of course, the situation, the context will maybe lead to sometimes at different rates of some use of speech acts than more than others. But I think that still, for instance, input will be calibrated to the knowledge of the child. The child has its own system that is going to be in development and therefore changing with age. So I think that, yeah, I agree completely with you, Shanley.
It also reminds me of Birgit's point about the different contexts and the bush, garden, village context, and that a comment that you need to take, that we don't provide particular instruction and you just have to make a decision and then take that decision into consideration in your analysis and discussion. And it seems to be exactly the same thing. If you take the playgroup setting, then you have to take that into consideration.
Maybe it comes back a bit to Rowena's question too, like there is no perfect data and there is no one perfect context in which children produce their perfect language and other contexts in which, all of these contexts are contexts in which kids are talking, and that's good. I guess I might have questions if it's a very constrained experimental situation, but then you're unlikely to get 30 minutes of data anyway, of speech data. So.
Especially from 2-year-olds.
Right.
So we're heading to the top of the hour now. So if there's no more questions, or this is your last chance to ask the question, if there aren't any more, then I thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you in the next. Shanley has a hand up.
Well, I just thought it might be good if we could take 2 minutes to ask people, is anybody starting to work on a sketch? Has anybody started collecting data or started analyzing data you have already, or anything like that?
Actually, we started with the child from Uganda. Celestino, would you like to say something about it? Can you
Yes, I hope I'm audible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my colleague Sigal, as she has said, we have started recording a child from Uganda, and we haven't really gone far. We only collected the 2 samples, which we think we can transcribe. We haven't even reached the stage of transcription. We are only testing, trying to get an experience of how we can record this child in a much better way. So he's aged 1 year and 10 months, and we are using the maid to help us record him. Mm-hmm. About the context, he lives in Kampala. It is a city in a home, but he definitely hasn't gone to school. So much of the language that he speaks is Luganda. We are working with Luganda language. Although the maid tries to ask him a few things in English, and given the family context, of course, they speak some English. So at times you hear some English in the recording. So that kind of context, I don't know whether it is bilingual or purely Luganda, the target language, but it has that kind of setting. Then we also intend to get a second child, but we thought probably the context could be a setting in the village, much away from the city. it will involve travel, and also it will involve kind of monitoring, because we may not be right there. But if we have to be there, then we have to keep close the child for some days and record. Really, that's the farthest that we have gone, and the kind of plan that we intend to implement on how we shall analyze. Maybe my colleague has a few more things to say. Thank you.
Thank you. That's super exciting.
Yeah.
Alan, you said that you wanted to mention something.
Yeah, I'd just like to respond briefly to, I think it was Evan's question about whether there's anybody else who's considering coming on board or has already started writing a sketch. And I've worked on language acquisition in the New Guinea Highlands in a particular place for nearly 10 years now, and have over 200 hours of longitudinal data in that session. We've written a number of different articles on different topics within it, some morphosyntactic, some morphological, etc. And I'm currently involved in a project on multimodality in that data, but we don't have anything like a kind of summary sketch of language acquisition in the area. And I've been encouraged by reading the issue of language documentation to see that this is actually rather comparable to Shanley's situation in Inuktitut. You have 200 hours there too, and you have written a number of studies, or various people have written a number of studies on different aspects of it, but no kind of synthetic study. And I'm strongly considering doing that with my colleagues who are working on the Kuwo side of it. Partly, although we've got 200 hours of data, very little of it is annotated and has interlinear glosses for it. And so, like, just pulling 5 hours out of that is quite a task, and I think it would be especially, I would be pleased to have the manual, the sketch acquisition manual, which I read when it was kind of in process, as a guide for how to do that, how to pull it all together. So we're strongly considering it. I'll say that.
Super. Yeah, that's exactly like my situation, because I've done several in-depth studies, but I think, but it was completely, well, not completely different, but it was a very different thing doing a general overview. And I think also much more useful for speech language pathologists and the community in general to have an overview of the stages of development, rather than here's a whole intense study on the passive. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Who cares about the passive? But a general development is more useful for the community, I think.
Michaela, you raised your hand.
I'm currently collecting data for my PhD, so I'm working on Maltese first language acquisition. I started in 2021, so it doesn't lend itself perfectly, but I am collecting data from 8 children, and 4 of them are girls, the other 4 are boys, from around 1.5 years till 5 years. So it's longitudinal. I started at 1.5 years with half of them, and with the other half I started at 3.5. And then I'm collecting data every 4 to 6 months. I do have both naturalistic and specific elicitation tasks. So, and what I don't have is the adult interaction, because I'm interacting with them myself when I'm there. So in some ways, it is kind of, it does lend itself, but I'm still halfway there, so I haven't submitted my work myself yet, and I haven't collected all the data either. And another point is that although they are Maltese dominant, the language situation in Malta is very much bilingual, so there's language mixing in all of the recordings.
I think when it comes, thanks for raising that. It sounds really exciting, because I know there's not a great deal on Maltese in the published data papers that we have out there. I guess the thing about the mixing is one of the things about the sketch acquisition project is that it does take a lot of inspiration from language documentation. And if there's mixing, then there's mixing, right? And then that's just part of the analysis itself. So it certainly shouldn't stop you from, or thinking stop you from thinking that you could do a sketch on it. It's actually just a really interesting a process that is documenting what is going on and what it means to acquire Maltese in Malta because of the multilingual situation. A few people have put in the chat that they're also planning on doing it or have data. So Rowena has data on Tagalog. I know of that data because she collected it, but when she was working in my group, and it was kind of inspired by the cross-linguistic nature of the sketch corpus construction. Angel said that she's hoping to do one in Cantonese, and then Caroline is going to do one on a language in PNG, and said that she would share her ethics materials if accepted. I'm sure the ethics application will be accepted. So we're looking forward to your materials coming our way, Caroline. Okay. Does anyone else want to share anything or ask any questions?
I would just like to say that one of the things we've talked about is, as people are starting projects, to put a page on the website saying like who's working on which language, like they do for the CDI, for example. And we have so far not thought about having like an application process where you'd have to be approved by some committee to officially do an acquisition sketch. But we do think it would be helpful to have a list of sketch writers on the website so that you have other people to contact to know who else is doing this. And also if you're thinking of one and then you look at the website and say, oh my goodness, somebody else is doing one in Luganda, either I better stop or let's get together or whatever. Would people be okay with that? Would you say like, no, that puts too much pressure, or I don't want that's publicly available, or? Okay. Looks like most people could be okay, so we could continue thinking in that direction. Okay, good.
Right.
Nino says in the chat, we in Georgia have collected data from 4 Georgian-speaking children, which we were thinking of analyzing for the languages sketch project. That would be wonderful. It'd be super.
Yeah, I think Georgian is a really interesting language, and it'll be great to have it as part of the. It would be great to have a sketch on it. That's for sure. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Or if there isn't, then we can end the meeting. So thank you so much for coming and for your interest. And we'll be in contact via probably the Google group in order to inform you about what we'll be talking about in the next symposium / workshop. I never know what to call it. If you've got a good name, please let me know.
And if you have particular things you'd like us to talk about, don't hesitate to let us know. The goal of the group is to serve more sketches.